I lived in my home for over 40 years, believing I knew every corner, every shadow, every memory inside it. After my husband passed away, I decided to renovate the hallway, something I had put off for years. But when the wallpaper was stripped away, a hidden door appeared, one that had been deliberately concealed all along. Behind it was a secret room filled with boxes, photographs, and documents that should have never existed. What I discovered inside didn't just shock me. It unraveled my entire life, my marriage, and the man I thought I truly knew. Before I tell you everything, subscribe to our channel and comment, where are you watching from? My name is Eleanor. I will not share my last name because my children have asked me not to. They are embarrassed, which I understand. They are angry, which I also understand. But they are also in denial, which I do not understand at all, because denial has never once served a single person in the history of this world. The truth does not become less true because you refuse to look at it. The room does not disappear because you pretend the door is not there. The door. I should start with the door. My husband Harold passed away 14 months ago. He was 81 years old, and he died the way he lived, quietly, without drama, in his armchair by the window with a cup of tea going cold on the side table beside him. The hospice nurse found him at 6 in the morning when she came for her shift. She said he looked peaceful. I have been told this so many times since then that the word peaceful has lost all meaning to me. People say it because they do not know what else to say, and because they want to comfort you, and because they genuinely believe it is a gift for a person to die without pain. I do not argue with any of that. Harold was a quiet man who lived a quiet life, and there was something right about him leaving the same way he arrived in it, without announcement, without spectacle, without disturbing anyone. Or so I thought. Harold died in October. By January, I had decided that the house needed work. Not because Harold would have objected. He was gone, and the house was mine now in every legal and practical sense. But because I had spent 14 months unable to touch a single thing that reminded me of him, which meant that I had spent 14 months barely able to move through my own home. His cardigan was still on the hook by the back door. His reading glasses were still on the side table where the hospice nurse had left them after she found him. His shoes were lined up under the hall bench in a row that I had preserved like an exhibit in a museum, unable to move them, unable to donate them, unable to face the idea that moving them meant something I was not ready to face. A grief counselor, my daughter Patricia insisted I see one after the 6-month mark, told me that what I was experiencing was completely normal. She said that objects carry memory the same way people carry history. She said that when you cannot move the shoes, it is because moving the shoes feels like erasing the person. She was right. But she also told me that there comes a time when living among a dead person's preserved things stops being a memorial and starts being a prison. She was right about that too. So I called a contractor in January. His name was Darnell, and he had been recommended by my neighbor Beverly, who had him redo her kitchen in the autumn, and raved about him for 3 months straight at every opportunity. I told Darnell I wanted the front hallway redone. The wallpaper in the hallway had not been changed since we moved in, and it was a faded pattern of green ivy on cream that had yellowed over the decades into something that looked more like a cautionary tale than a decorating choice. I wanted the wallpaper stripped and the walls properly plastered and painted a warm white. I wanted the floor refinished. I wanted the overhead light replaced with something that actually lit the space instead of casting everything in a dim amber that had always made visitors look like they were walking into a sepia photograph. Darnell came on a Monday morning in the second week of January. He brought 2 young men with him, and together they began the methodical process of stripping the old wallpaper from the hallway walls. I had retreated to the kitchen with my tea to stay out of their way, and I was reading the newspaper. I still take the physical newspaper, a habit Harold and I shared for decades, when Darnell appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression on his face that I did not know how to read. He said, "Mrs. Eleanor, I think you should come see something." I thought he had found water damage. Old houses develop leaks in their walls the way old people develop aches in their joints. Silently, gradually, until one day the damage is visible, and you wonder how long it had been there without your knowing. I put down my newspaper and followed him into the hallway, fully prepared to discuss the likely cost of replastering a damaged section of wall. It was not water damage. The wallpaper had been stripped from the left wall of the hallway, the long wall that runs from the front door all the way to the staircase. And in the section approximately 4 feet from the base of the stairs, where a tall, narrow, decorative shelf had always stood, there was a door. Not a crack in the plaster, not a shadow or an illusion. A door. A proper fitted door with its hinges still intact, its frame still tight to the wall, the edges of it sealed with what appeared to be multiple layers of old wallpaper paste and deliberate, careful concealment. The narrow shelf, the one that had always held a ceramic vase, 3 framed family photographs, and a small brass lamp, had been positioned directly in front of it, not randomly, not decoratively, but specifically, intentionally, as a screen. I stood in my hallway, and I stared at this door for what felt like a very long time. Darnell stood beside me and did not say anything, which I was grateful for, because I needed the silence to process what I was seeing. I had never noticed the door. In 41 years, I had never noticed it. Harold had placed the shelf in front of that wall the week after we moved in. I remembered it clearly now, with the strange clarity that certain memories acquire when they are suddenly given a meaning they never had before. I remembered him saying the hallway felt bare, and that the shelf would break up the space nicely. I remembered thinking he was right. I had never had any reason to think otherwise. You do not stand in your own hallway scrutinizing the wall behind a shelf when the shelf has a vase on it and photographs that you love and a small brass lamp that lights the space just enough in the evenings. Darnell asked if I wanted to open it. I said yes. The door had no lock, or rather, whatever lock it had once possessed had been deliberately removed, the mechanism extracted, and the hole in the door frame filled with wood putty and painted over so smoothly that you would only notice the repair if you were looking for it. The door opened inward, moving on hinges that had been oiled recently enough that they made no sound at all. I registered this detail separately from everything else. The hinges had been oiled. Not 40 years ago when the door was sealed, recently, which meant Harold had opened this door. Not once, decades ago, and then sealed it forever. He had been opening it. He had been maintaining access. Behind the door was a room. It was not a large room. It was perhaps 8 feet wide and 12 feet deep, with a low ceiling that a tall person would have had to duck to stand comfortably beneath. And Harold had been a tall person, so perhaps he had always ducked. There was no window. There was a single bare light bulb on a cord from the ceiling, connected to a switch on the inside wall beside the door. A switch that I had never seen from the hallway side, because the door had been sealed and covered for the entirety of my life in this house. I reached inside and found the switch and turned on the light. The room held boxes, 11 of them, I counted later, when I had gathered myself enough to be methodical. They were cardboard boxes of various sizes, sealed with packing tape, and they were stacked against the far wall in a neat arrangement that suggested someone had thought carefully about organization. Beside the boxes, against the right wall, there was a small wooden table, the same kind of folding card table that Harold kept in the garage for when we hosted large Thanksgiving dinners and needed extra surface space for the dishes. On this table there was a metal strongbox, the old-fashioned kind with a combination lock, and on the left wall, hanging on small nails driven into the plaster, there were photographs. Not the photographs I knew, not our wedding photographs or the photographs of our children or the holiday snapshots that lined the rest of the walls in the house. These were different photographs. They were black and white, some of them. Others were early color photographs, the kind with the slightly washed-out palette of the 1970s. They showed people I did not recognize. A woman, young and dark-haired, standing in front of what appeared to be a beach house. The same woman, older, in a garden. A child, a girl, I thought, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, on a bicycle. The same girl, older, in what appeared to be a school photograph. A man I recognized standing beside the dark-haired woman in what appeared to be a kitchen. The man was Harold. He was younger, much younger than I had ever known him. The photograph appeared to be from the early 1970s, more than a decade before I met him. And in it he was perhaps 30 years old, and he was standing with his arm around this dark-haired woman in a kitchen I had never seen. And he was smiling a smile that I recognized from our 40 years together. Wide, genuine, the particular smile that Harold only produced when he was genuinely happy. And the woman beside him was smiling back at him. And on the refrigerator behind them, held by a magnet, was a child's drawing. I took the photograph off the nail. On the back, in Harold's handwriting, the looping, slightly cramped handwriting I had read on 40 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the kitchen counter, were 4 words, 2 names and a year. The names were Margaret and Harold Jr. The year was 1972. I sat down on the floor of the hidden room. I sat on the floor because there was nowhere to sit, and because my legs had decided, without consulting me, that standing was no longer an option they were willing to support. Darnell and his two assistants had very quietly removed themselves to the far end of the hallway. I could hear them speaking in low voices. I could hear Darnell say that perhaps they should take their lunch break early. I heard the front door close. They were decent men. I have always been grateful for their discretion on that morning. I sat on the floor of that room for 20 minutes. Then I got up and I began to go through the boxes. The first box contained letters, hundreds of them, bundled in rubber bands, organized by year. The earliest were from 1968. The latest were from 1984. They were letters written between Harold and a woman named Margaret Calloway, and they told a story that I read in pieces, going back and forth between bundles, trying to assemble the chronology before I could allow myself to understand the substance. Harold and Margaret had met in 1966. They had dated for 2 years. In 1969, they had married. I found the marriage certificate in the second box, a folded piece of paper, officially stamped, recording the marriage of Harold James Whitmore and Margaret Ann Calloway in the county of Cook, Illinois, on the 14th of March, 1969. In 1971, Margaret had given birth to a son. The son was named Harold Jr., Harry, the letters called him, and Margaret's early letters about him were full of the ordinary, exhausted joy of a new mother writing to a husband who traveled for work. Harold had traveled for work. I knew this. He was a regional sales manager for a manufacturing company, and he was often gone for weeks at a time. I had always understood this about him. I had accepted it as simply the nature of his profession. I had not understood that when Harold traveled, he was sometimes traveling to Illinois, to a house in a suburb of Chicago, where his wife and his son lived. He had met me in 1978. We had dated for 2 years and married in 1980. By then, Harold and Margaret had been separated. Their letters made this clear, since 1977. The separation had been Harold's decision. Margaret's letters from 1977 and 1978 were different in tone from the earlier ones. They were not the letters of a woman writing to a beloved husband. They were the letters of a woman who had been left, and who was trying first to understand, and then to accept, and finally to survive the fact of it. They were some of the most painful things I have ever read. But they were not, and this took me a long time to absorb, divorce papers. There was no divorce decree in any of the boxes. Harold and Margaret had separated in 1977, but they had never divorced. They were still legally married when Harold married me in 1980, which meant that my marriage, the marriage I had built my entire adult life around, the marriage that had produced 3 children and 40 years of shared history, and a grief so large I had been unable to move my husband's shoes for 14 months, was not a legal marriage. It was not recognized by any court in any state. It had never been. I found the Strongbox combination in a letter from 1983. Margaret had written it to Harold at a time when she clearly believed their correspondence was private and would never be read by anyone else. She had written it in the context of a discussion about financial arrangements for their son Harry, who was then 12 years old and apparently receiving regular payments from Harold for his education. The combination was 6 digits. I tried it. The Strongbox opened. Inside the Strongbox there was cash. $15,000 in banded bills. There was a second set of identity documents, a driver's license, a social security card, a passport, all bearing Harold's photograph but a different name. The name was Robert Allen Marsh. The passport had been renewed most recently in 2019. Harold had renewed a passport in a different name in 2019 while he was married to me, while he was in his late 70s, and I had never known. There was also in the Strongbox a handwritten letter addressed to no one specifically. It began, "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the time for explanations has finally arrived." I took the letter and I went to the kitchen, and I sat at the table where I had been reading my newspaper an hour earlier, and I read every word. Harold's letter explained, in the careful, organized manner of a man who had planned his revelations with the same precision he brought to everything else, the following. He had married Margaret in 1969 because she was pregnant, and because in 1969, for a young man from a conservative Midwestern family, there was no other acceptable path. He had tried to make the marriage work for 8 years and had found himself unable to. The person he had been in that marriage was not, he wrote, the person he actually was. He did not elaborate on this beyond saying that he had been living a version of himself that did not fit, the way a coat fits badly, and you know from the first wearing that it will never be right. When he left Margaret in 1977, he left with the intention of filing for divorce, but found himself unable to do so because Margaret refused to acknowledge the separation in legal terms, and because their son Harry was 6 years old, and because Harold had discovered, this is the word he used, discovered, that a legal proceeding would require the disclosure of financial matters that he was not prepared to disclose, the financial matters. Harold's letter addressed these too, though with less clarity and more obfuscation than the emotional sections, which I found telling. The company Harold worked for as a regional sales manager had apparently involved him at various points in the 1970s in the movement of funds that Harold described as irregular. He did not use the word illegal. He did not need to. A man who maintains an alternate identity document with a renewed passport does not do so because he has nothing to hide from the law. The identity documents under the name Robert Allen Marsh, Harold's letter explained, had been obtained in the early 1980s as a precautionary measure related to his ongoing concern that the financial irregularities of his earlier career might one day be investigated. They had never been needed. He had maintained them out of a habit of caution that had, over the decades, become simply another part of the infrastructure of his life, something he managed the way he managed everything, quietly, without drama, without ever telling me a single word of it. He apologized. The letter was long, and it apologized many times and in many different ways, and I will say that the apologies did not make me feel better. But I will also say that they were clearly genuine, and that Harold, the real Harold, whoever that person actually was, had carried the weight of this secret for the entirety of our life together. And that there is something in that image, something in the picture of the quiet man in his armchair with his cold tea and his peaceful expression, that I find myself unable to fully condemn. I am not able to forgive. But I am also no longer able to simply be angry. The truth of Harold is too complicated for simple anger. He was a man who made catastrophic choices early in his life and then spent 40 years maintaining them in the only way he knew how, by keeping them hidden, by being kind, by being present, by being in every way he was capable of being, a good husband and a good father to the children he had with me. He was also a man who had a son, Harry Whitmore, who would have been, at the time I found that room, 53 years old. I called my daughter Patricia first. I called her not because she is the eldest, that is my son Raymond, but because Patricia has always been the one in my family who deals with difficult information directly, rather than retreating from it. I had once watched Patricia sit across from a doctor who told her that her daughter, my granddaughter Lily, had a serious illness, and Patricia had asked every hard question, written down every answer, and walked out of that office with a plan. That is the kind of person she is. That is why I called her first. Patricia arrived at my house within 40 minutes, which told me she had driven faster than was legal. She came in through the front door, and I showed her the open doorway in the hallway, and she stood there for a moment looking at it with the expression of a woman whose brain is catching up to her eyes. And then she walked into the room and looked at the photographs on the wall and picked up the one of Harold and Margaret and stood there holding it in both hands. She did not speak for a very long time. Then she said, "How long has this room been here?" I told her everything I knew. She listened without interrupting, which is not Patricia's usual manner. She is a woman who processes information by asking questions as it arrives, but she listened. When I finished, she put down the photograph and she said very quietly, "We have to call Raymond." Raymond did not take it well. Raymond had always been the child most devoted to Harold's memory. He was the one who had organized the memorial service. He was the one who had chosen the readings and spoken the eulogy and cried openly and without self-consciousness at the graveside in a way that I had found both moving and a little heartbreaking. He arrived at the house 30 minutes after Patricia called him, and he walked into the hallway and looked at the open door, and he said, "This is not real." I showed him the marriage certificate. I showed him the letter. I showed him the identity documents in the name of Robert Allen Marsh. I watched my son's face work through something that took a very long time, and I thought about Harold doing the same thing in this house for 40 years, keeping the same face, maintaining the same composure, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, what that must have cost him. Raymond said, "We have to find out if Margaret is still alive." Patricia said, "We have to find out if Harry is still alive." I said, "We have to call a lawyer." The lawyer came to the house the following day. She was a woman named Sandra Park, who had been referred to me by my own attorney, and she spent 2 hours in my kitchen going through the documents from the boxes in the Strongbox, while Patricia and Raymond and I sat across from her and waited. When she finished, she looked up and she said the following things, in order. 1. My marriage to Harold had been a bigamous marriage and was therefore legally void from the date it was contracted. 2. This had implications for the disposition of Harold's estate. 3. The existence of a prior marriage and a biological child, Harry, meant that the probate of Harold's estate, which had been completed 8 months earlier on the assumption that I was his legal wife and that my 3 children were his only heirs, would need to be reopened and reassessed. 4. The identity documents under the name Robert Allen Marsh would need to be reported, as their existence constituted a legal irregularity that she was not certain she could advise me to simply put back in the box. 5. She was very sorry, and she understood that this was an enormous amount of difficult information, and she wanted me to know that I had options, and that none of this was insurmountable. I listened to all of this. I had not cried yet. I had not cried in the hidden room, and I had not cried when I read Harold's letter. And I had not cried when I told Patricia and Raymond, and I did not cry now. I do not know exactly why. I think perhaps I was too far past the kind of grief that produces tears. I had spent 14 months grieving Harold as I had known him, and now I was grieving him all over again as the man he had actually been. And the second grief was different from the first, quieter, more angular, without the soft edges that the first grief had. The first grief had been about loss. The second grief was about the discovery that what you had lost was not quite what you thought. My youngest child, my daughter Miriam, who lives in another state and who I had not yet told, called me that evening by coincidence. She calls every Tuesday, a habit she has maintained for 15 years. And I had to decide in the moment whether to tell her or wait. I told her. Miriam is 44 years old, and she is the most emotionally intelligent of my 3 children, which sometimes means she feels things more acutely than the others, but it also means she is the most capable of sitting with complexity. She cried. She cried for a long time on the phone while I sat in my kitchen and told her everything. And I listened to her cry, and I felt something finally crack open in me, not all the way, but enough to let a little of the pressure out. We found Harry Whitmore 3 weeks later. Sandra Park hired a researcher, and the researcher found him in less than 5 days. He had not moved far from where he had grown up, and he was living in a suburb of Chicago, working as a high school history teacher, and he was 53 years old, and he had a wife and 2 grown children of his own. Harry Whitmore knew about me. He had known about me for most of his adult life. His mother, Margaret, who was still alive, 82 years old, living in a care facility in Illinois, had told him when he was in his 20s that his father had another family, had told him the broad outlines of what had happened, had encouraged him not to seek contact because she did not want the other family's peace disturbed. Harry had followed his mother's wishes. He had received financial support from Harold throughout his childhood and young adulthood, and he had never reached out, and he had thought for years after Harold's death. He had known about Harold's death because his mother's care facility received a small, regular financial contribution that had stopped arriving after October of the previous year, that the chapter was simply closed. The money stopped coming. The man was gone. That was the end. Until Sandra Park's researcher called him. Harry Whitmore drove from Illinois to see me on a Saturday morning in February, 6 weeks after we found the hidden room. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold had sat for 40 years, drinking his morning coffee, reading the news, being the quiet, kind, attentive man I had loved. And I looked at Harry, and I saw Harold's nose. I saw Harold's hands. I saw Harold's way of holding himself when he was uncertain. The slight forward lean, the careful attention to the person across from him. We talked for 4 hours. Harry was not angry with me. He made this clear immediately and maintained it throughout. He was not angry with his mother. He was, he said, something he could not quite name, a feeling adjacent to grief, adjacent to relief, adjacent to a kind of wondering that he had been carrying quietly for 30 years about the shape of his own story, and whether the piece of it that was missing could ever be found. He had not expected to feel the things he was feeling. He had expected to feel more complicated things, resentment perhaps, or defensiveness, or the particular pain of a person confronting the inheritance they did not receive. He did not feel those things, or at least not primarily. Primarily, he said, he felt like he was sitting in his father's kitchen for the first time, and that was both terrible and something like grace. I do not use the word grace lightly. I am a practical woman who has been a practical woman for 78 years, and I do not traffic in sentiment as a habit. But sitting across from Harold's son in Harold's kitchen, watching Harold's hands fold themselves around a cup of my tea, I understood something about Harold that I had not been able to understand from the letter alone. That the life he had built with me, whatever its foundations, had been real to him. That the love had been real. That the grief he carried for the choices he had made before I knew him had been real. And that the room, that sealed, careful, organized, meticulously maintained room behind the wallpaper, had been his way of carrying it all without it destroying everything he had built. Not a good way, not an honest way, but his way, and a very Harold way, quiet, contained, without drama, without disturbing anyone. My 3 children have had mixed responses to Harry. Raymond has struggled the most. He does not dispute the facts. He is too honest a person to pretend the evidence does not exist. But he finds Harry's presence in our family narrative painful in a way that he is still working through. Patricia has been characteristically direct. She had a lawyer-to-lawyer conversation with Harry about the estate, which has been reopened and which will likely be resettled, with Harry receiving a share that reflects his position as Harold's eldest child. She was professional and fair, and I am proud of her. Miriam flew in from her state and met Harry and cried again openly, in a way that seemed to help both of them. The estate matters are being sorted. They are slow and complicated and will take another year at minimum. But Sandra Park is a capable woman, and Harry's attorney is apparently also reasonable, and there has been no adversarial proceeding. This is not a situation in which anyone is behaving badly, which surprises me sometimes because I expected worse. People are capable of worse. I have read enough of those stories to know. Margaret Calloway, Margaret Whitmore, died in April, 8 weeks after Harry's visit. She never knew that the hidden room had been found. Harry said she had known, in some abstract way, that Harold had kept records. He had always been a careful man, a man who documented things. But she had assumed those records were somewhere less dramatic than a sealed room in a house she had never visited. I think about her sometimes. I think about her writing those letters in the 1970s, the angry ones, the grief-stricken ones, the ones that tried to make sense of a man who had chosen a different life. I think about her getting old with the knowledge that the man who had left her had built a life with someone else that had lasted 40 years. And I try to extend to her the same complicated, angular, quiet grief that I am learning to extend to Harold. The hidden room is not there anymore. I had it opened up properly, the frame widened, the space replastered and integrated into the hallway. It is now a proper coat closet, which the house needed desperately. The boxes and the Strongbox and the photographs and the letters are in storage. The identity documents were turned over to the appropriate authorities, as Sandra Park advised, and the matter was reviewed and ultimately closed, given the age of the individual involved and his death. Nobody was charged with anything. The irregular financial matters from the 1970s proved on examination to be both genuinely irregular and genuinely old. Old enough that the statute of limitations had long since expired on everything involved. I still live in the house. My children have asked me several times whether I want to sell it and move somewhere smaller, somewhere without the history, somewhere that does not contain the ghosts. I have told them each time that I am 78 years old, and I have lived in this house for 41 years, and I have no intention of leaving. The house did not deceive me. The house did not keep secrets. The house simply held what was put into it, the way houses do. And now the coat closet holds my good winter coats and my umbrella and 3 cardboard boxes of things I have not needed in years but cannot bring myself to discard. I hung a small mirror on the inside wall of the closet, directly where Harold's photographs used to be. When I open the coat closet now, I see my own face looking back at me. Not Harold's hidden life, not Margaret's grief, not the boy on the bicycle who grew into a history teacher with Harold's hands. Just my own face. I am 78 years old. I have lived in my house for 41 years. I still know every creak in every floorboard. I still know every shadow that moves across the ceiling when the afternoon light comes through the living room curtains. The difference is that now I also know that knowing a place completely, knowing it with the certainty of decades, is not the same as knowing everything about it. And knowing a person completely, or believing you do, or building your life on the belief that you do, is perhaps the most profound and beautiful and occasionally devastating act of trust that two people can undertake together. Harold is buried in the cemetery 3 miles from the house. I visit on Sundays. I bring roses from the garden in the backyard. I do not know any more what I am saying when I stand there, or whether I am saying anything at all, but I go. Because 40 years of love does not become less real because the man who received it kept a room that you were not supposed to know about. Because grief does not ask permission. Because the rose garden in the backyard survived 4 decades of hard winters, and so, it turns out, have I. What would you have done if you found a hidden room in your home? Would you have opened those boxes? Or would you have sealed the door back up and let some secrets stay secret? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this.